Good morning and welcome to the Christmas edition of Media Monitor on SABC News Channel 404 on DSTV. I'm Sakina Kamwendo and thank you for tuning in. And here's what you can look forward to this hour. This morning we'll be taking a look at some of the major stories of 2017, and we'll start by looking at the hotly contested ANC 54th elective conference and what came out of it. And then we'll also take a look at state capture, including the Gupta leaks, which laid bare the shenanigans between government officials and the Gupta family. Then another story that made headlines this year is that of Life Esidimeni and the public hearings into the death of 143 psychiatric patients. And lastly, we'll take a look at the coup that unfolded in Zimbabwe, which saw the unseating of former President Robert Mugabe, who ruled for close to 4 decades. And we're pleased to welcome SABC journalist Ntakawana Ngatane. We also have media analyst Melo Magolejo, political analyst Professor Sipho Siepe, and SABC digital news producer Dini Mekuto. Good morning and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sakina.
Now let's start by taking a look at the big stories that were trending on social media in 2017 with Dini. So Dini, which ones came up tops?
Earlier in the year, there was an issue of money that was deposited into a student account at Walter Sisulu University in East London, 14 million rands. She didn't report it. She just started spending the money. And everyone went on social media saying, what would I have done if I had gotten this amount? A lot of people saying, I wouldn't have given it back. I would have also spent it. She went on a spending spree, having parties, buying expensive liquor, and buying a lot of weaves. Here's a tweet from Ziad Hanwa. He's saying, if 14 million rands got deposited into my account from NSFAS, I'd use it to pay off student debts. Oh, that's what people are saying. He would respond by saying, what color Lamborghini should I get? So, he'd get an expensive car.
That's a thought.
NSFAS Bola, Sibongile Mani or Money. That's her surname, actually.
And that was to be expected. But, yeah, I think one's mind goes, runabout when you start thinking about having that much cash in your bank account. But, of course, the right thing to do, as boring as it is, would be to give it back.
Yeah. Another one that also had people talking towards the end of the year, corporate corruption, hashtag Steinhoff, hashtag KPMG. The main issue was with Steinhoff and the term that they were using to explain what went down at Steinhoff. They're saying it's accounting irregularities. There's a tweet from Samuel saying, so in government, it is fraud and corruption. Go private sector, it is called accounting irregularities. What's wrong here? And then another one from New York Koza, Steinhoff has a bomb PR team. That is why the words accounting irregularity are flying around. People comparing this to what has been said, and one of the issues we'll be talking about, state capture. It's called corruption. People come out condemning it, but when it is with the private sector, people kind of like sit back and say, doesn't seem as bad as it really is.
Yeah, it's semantics, it's technical, it's all of those things, but in the end, it's the same thing.
Knysna fires. This one is a bit controversial. The main talking point here was that corporates and people who were involved in providing relief came out flying, had social media campaigns saying, let's help Knysna. People were saying, but if this was in Alexandra, if this was a squatter camp in Deep Slot, we don't usually see corporate getting involved. Macro, one of the big retailers in the country, a big thank you to customers who gave to the Knysna fires and Cape Town storms, devastation. 38 pallets, blah, 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 blah. People are saying, look, if it's in Deep Slot, you don't see these drives from corporates.
And we hear this every year of shacks somewhere catching a light, and we do not see that sort of corporate response.
And they took it to the racial route. South Africans always like to include the racial debate, saying if it was black people in a squatter camp, we wouldn't see much help. But now that white people are getting affected, corporate are jumping on board and offering their monies and their help and their everything. Last one, which also includes a couple of other hashtags that were around a similar topic. Hashtag Mdumanana. There was a very interesting video that was caught by an SABC employee, Ulumko Jimlongo, at Cubana. This was an issue about a man assaulting a woman, but there were also other big hashtags that came from such similar incidents. Hashtag men are trash. If you remember a while back, there was also an incident of Tembisi Lenyendo who was found at an ESCOM building. And there was talk that a boyfriend could have been involved. There was also Karabo and Sandile. Sandile, a boyfriend who was said to have killed his woman. There was also stories coming from all over the world, mainly Hollywood, and locally there was a soccer boss that was also implicated, Danny Jordan. There were people from Hollywood. I remember Kevin Spacey. Recently, I heard about Sylvester Stallone. The issue of women, right? And women also came out with a hashtag Me Too. I've also been violated. I've also been assaulted by these men. So that was one of the biggest and most talked about issue. The issue of women abuse and women assault and rape.
And of course, this is not just any man. These are powerful men who have been caught, in these atrocious acts. So I think that's also important to highlight, because power brings with it very many different nuances as well.
And then some things we'll be talking about, of course, the Gupta emails that also trended, and it was an ongoing topic throughout the year. Life Esidimeni, we had a lot of traffic on our YouTube channel, people interested in the arbitration and the hearing within that space and what was going on within that case. It's still going to continue next year with Kedani Mahlangu. Hopefully she will finally appear. So people have been engaging on a lot of issues. Grace Mugabe was in Sandton. That also trended with AfriForum, protecting the lady that was assaulted, and then the coup. It's been a hectic year.
It certainly has. But of course, that's what the people on the social media platforms were talking about. But we'll take a look at what came out of the ANC's 54th elective conference that wrapped up this past Wednesday. But we'll do that after the break.
We cross live, give updates and cover sport.
The observer missions, what are they saying?
It will be a very difficult announcement to make, to say whether these elections have been free and fair.
1 in every 100 people are diagnosed with arthritis daily. In an effort to raise awareness, a handful of elderly women, they took to the streets of Soweto to stretch their fight against the ailment.
Western Province upset the Sharks by 33 points to 21 to be crowned the 2017 Currie Cup champions at the Kings Park Stadium.
In Durban.
On time with weather every hour, all the time. For all news, stay tuned to AM News every Saturday and Sunday at 10:00 hours Central African Time.
Welcome back. Now, the African National Congress has just elected new leadership. Cyril Ramaphosa was elected president, beating his fierce rival Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma at the highly charged 54th elective conference that was held at Nasrec on the south of Johannesburg. Now, he'd been serving as President Zuma's deputy since his election in Mangaung in 2012, and a lot has been said about the state of the party, with some even going as far as to say that it was highly divided, at war with itself, and the blame was to be put squarely at the door of President Jacob Zuma. The road to Nasrec was rocky, with opposing factions at each other's throats. Politicians were assassinated, and election disputes settled in court. And in fact, some had predicted that the conference might even collapse. But more on that in this insert.
The conference has been an amazing success. We emerged from this conference more united, and I'm extremely happy and I'm very hopeful that we have a great future. And what is most important is the fact that I think we are now going to be able to deal with this downgrading of our country. I have every hope that we are going to increase our production and that there's a great future for South Africa in the next 5 years. The country seems to have a great hopes about the fact that at least he's from a business background, and we are going to do everything in our power to help him clean our name from this corruption and the fact that it is thought we cannot administer this country.
No reason not to be happy. I'm very happy. The young people, they push us, but I think we achieved almost everything we wanted to achieve out of this conference. Going forward, we'll work hard that things are implemented.
No, definitely. And I think President Ramaphosa has given very clear leadership about the economy, about the fact that we were here to serve our people, about the tough task we have of eradicating corruption, of making the state-owned companies work for the people of South Africa and not to put money into the pockets of a few individuals. But at the same time, he's committed himself and ourselves to unity amongst us, and a unity that must be based on the principles that he outlined.
Always the branch have decided, and whoever has won, that is the ANC. So there is no any other issue. The majority of members and delegates of the ANC have spoken, and ours is to make sure that we rally people behind the ANC. We unite, we forget about, that's the nature of conferences. We must now start working and rebuilding the structures of the movement.
I think the outcome of this conference in terms of leadership is very good for us. We have been talking a lot about unity. You know that we had many meetings with Comrade Didi Mabuza and others. And I think the delegates responded. It's up to us now to make sure that we really work together as a collective.
So that's what most of us were consumed by this past week. But of course, just taking a look at the ANC, going into that conference, Professor Siepe, unity was the buzzword. Did the ANC come out of it united?
Well, I think that we should leave the time. But what is true is what you call a hotly contested, and I would say it was actually ferocious. In itself, it's an expression of the people moving to a campaigning is accepted. Remember, in the past, the ANC used to argue that we don't campaign. But there's a normalization of politics where you had the members of the ANC availing themselves to say we want to lead. But what has been unfortunate is that it has not been able to dislodge the notion of slate politics. So by the time we went there, it was very clear that it was a two-horse race, but the positions were almost cemented. In a sense, it was saved by the delegates themselves, who actually said we are going to put a prime on unity rather than adopt the slate politics. So that is one thing that is positive. Now, the question that you're raising, people are saying, is this a truce or is this a form of unity? Whether you had a ceasefire, and when you have a ceasefire, what it means that people will then go back to their position. But when you look at the top six, effectively you saw a representation of both slates, and the NEC also reflects the same element. But what was also very important coming out of the conference is what people were shocked in terms of the policy pronouncements. The big business was shocked when the issue of land was put. I mean, I've had a number of questions coming from overseas interest, and the issue that was on the table was land expropriation without compensation. Then the free higher education, and I mean, there's a lot that the new president will have to deal with. And also the pressure on him by some people saying it's time to change and remove the president.
And Professor Siepe talking about the policy discussions, but Ntakwana, someone who was there, you know, and this is a question that has been looming for the ANC for quite some time as well. Is this really about policy? Because if you think about the time that was spent deliberating on policy as compared to the time, you know, that was spent on getting ready and actually conducting elections, How much would you say this is actually about policy issues?
Well, this is the comment that I've been making since the conference, Sakina, to say that, in fact, we spend more time on whether the credentials were right, and then the 68. And, of course, on the very last day, the last few hours, we then started packing, all of those policies into about 2 hours of the conference. So, honestly, I cannot say that it was given justice. But also, when you look at the position, or rather the positions within the conference itself, the question that then comes out is, when you listen to Cyril Ramaphosa at the end, people were saying, how come he didn't even mention the word state capture when he kind of spoke around the corruption and everything else around state-owned enterprises? And then the policy committee on governance, I believe, also spoke about how it wants the commission to investigate state capture, but then the president doesn't come out to call it state capture. And also white monopoly capital, the commission there coming out also to say that they see white monopoly capital as one of the issues that needs to be dealt with. But when you look at going to the conference, there were people who were actually saying that the now president is a stooge of white monopoly capital. So some of these issues, sort of, you see the party coming out still on different positions regarding some of these key issues.
Miller, how would you describe the ANC over the past 10 years under President Jacob Zuma?
I mean, obviously, the ANC has been much embroiled in Jacob Zuma's person, as it were, whether it be in his legal issues, whether it be in his marital issues, whether it be it in the way he's running government per se. And for me, I think that has been very much very interesting to watch, in the sense that there's been sort of like Jacob Zuma has been a distraction within the ANC. There's a lot of issues within the country that have not been really been addressed because everybody's been so focused on Jacob Zuma, the person. For me, the interesting thing that came out of the conference was the notion how Didi Mabuza, in a sense, for me, I feel like, was a shift in the culture of the ANC. And that shift per se is that typically what you have is that you have candidates who have people lobbying on their behalf, campaigning on their behalf to become in leadership positions and so on. In this sense, you had like sort of a power broker, being a regional leader, being Didi Mabuza, coming in and saying that, you know what, actually, I want to be deputy president. And in that sense, it's almost like he's using his raw power now to propel himself into a leadership position. And that, for me, I think, over and above issues of whether or not the ANC has open contestation or not, this shift, I think, is a fundamental shift, because what it does is that it puts the ANC sort of on a path where people would say that, you know what, the path is to accumulate power on the ground, have raw power, go into conference and say that, you know what, I want to be put in a leadership position.
It's an interesting dynamic, because speaking to the balance of forces within the top six before we even trickle down to the NEC, there were those who felt that Didi Mabuza had betrayed them.
Oh, actually, there's no doubt among members of the Nkosazana camp, because all along, even when they talk about numbers and the confidence that they had a night before, they say something actually happened. And even those who spoke to Nkosazana argue that she is not concerned so much about losing. It is more the betrayal when you have somebody says, I'm going to deliver delegates. And then there's a calculation. And you must also go back to Nkosazana's own understanding. Whenever there were issues of courts, when the conference started, then the people said, no, we are going to make sure that all the delegates who are implicated will be excluded. She was very comfortable, said, no, let them go, because she was sure that the numbers are on her side. And they added just a night before. And actually, there's also evidence. I mean, you saw Tony Leon's tweet saying money had been thrown. So we should actually accept that money played a major role. But nonetheless, we should also respect the delegates when they came to say, we are going to give you a sense that says, let there be peace, let there be representation on both sides. And that is a message that came. But also, even the so-called victory, you should see it's a razor thin. If you look at the percentage, it is less than 2%. So the effect of that shows first the issue that you're saying it's hotly contested, it was fierce, but it also says people were saying we're not going to give you a resounding success or victory. We're going to remind you that...
But then, this then basically scuppers this notion that we've been hearing about a two-way split, 3-3 in the top 6. Because if then Didi Mabuza had sold out, that means that Cyril Ramaphosa would have the balance of forces within the top 6. And Ntakwana?
Well, Sakina, I think if you also want to look at, bring back the unity issue, look at the Secretary General now. He has been elected, was elected in the Free State as a premier, and the understanding was that with the PEC there now having been declared null and void, he would then go back and recontest. But that means that he cannot go back because he has now been elected to a higher position. What happens to his position as a premier? What happens to, those misunderstandings that were there? Does he then relinquish the position to the person who was his so-called contestant, who is his deputy chair, or the deputy chair in the previous PEC, Thabo Manyoni? And all of these things speak to what then happens after this conference.
There's still a lot to do, but just very briefly, Melo, the question of President Jacob Zuma, as many of you have alluded to, what does Cyril Ramaphosa do?
I think, it's very interesting. If you look at other countries, they've tended to avoid this sort of like two centers of power because, as people were saying, that in government, it's sort of like Jacob Zuma, Cyril's boss, but in the ANC, Cyril is Jacob Zuma's boss. So that puts him in a very precarious position. So I do not think that Cyril, per se, has a clear mandate to go one way or the other, because in the ANC, as we say, this split is going to come and play itself out in the dynamics in terms of what it is exactly that he does with Jacob Zuma. I think another issue also with the state capture is that he might find it a bit problematic there, because in a lot of the talk about state capture, one name that keeps coming up is Isma Khashula's name. So once you start having a commission of inquiry now with broad terms of reference, now are you going to have an SG now going and testifying, especially given that now we're going to an election cycle for 2019? That puts the ANC in a very precarious position, given especially that Cyril Ramaphosa wants to become president of the country.
Well, very interesting, because the ANC, of course, will argue that this is why they have a policy conference where they can take all the time they need to discuss the policy issues. And when it comes to conference, it is up to conference simply to ratify, rubber stamp what has already been discussed. But also one of the important things they did resolve at conference was that it was the ANC where the seat of power would lie, and that government would take its instruction from the African National Congress. So that's going to be interesting to see how that two centers of power issue is resolved. But the Gupta leaks and more coming up after the break on Media Monitor.
Your evening well informed with primetime news.
Thanks for tuning in. You're watching SABC News Prime. The burning land reform issue was also a point of discussion on the first day.
If you do not have a skills revolution, you will run into the kind of problems that we're having at the moment.
We have funded about 466,000 students, out of about 800,000 students that are in the university system.
South Africa says insufficient electricity and water remains one of the biggest barriers to development and prosperity on the continent.
The top 4 batsmen in the squad, Hashim Amla, Quinton de Kock, Faf du Plessis and AB de Villiers, are certainties in the starting lineup.
I really believe we cover all bases when it comes to spin bowling, seam bowling, proper pace bowling, and an amazing batting lineup.
Stay tuned every Monday to Sunday from 6 p.m.
And welcome back to this Christmas edition of Media Monitor. South Africa was rocked to its foundations after the revelation of the full extent of the Gupta family's influence over President Jacob Zuma's government. Now, it started with former top government officials SABC Jonas and Feki Mentor going public about how the family tried to induce them with money and positions in return for dishing out favors for their companies. And former Communications Minister Faith Mutambi was a strong ally of President President Jacob Zuma was reported to have shared information related to government policy with one of the Gupta brothers even before it was discussed with her cabinet colleagues. And as if that was not enough, Amapungane, they leaked hundreds of thousands of bombshell emails where the Guptas were implicated, and public servants and associates also suggested of having been involved in grand corruption of hundreds of millions of rands. And even the public relations companies like Bell Pottinger, you had accounting firm KPMG, they got hooked up in the state capture web and paid a heavy price for it. And at some point, former public protector Thuli Madonsela released the state of capture report that was very critical of the president as well as the executive for failing to act on claims that there had been interference in the appointment of ministers and directors at state-owned entities. Now, the report ordered President Jacob Zuma to appoint a commission of inquiry to be headed by a judge, and that has not yet happened. It's more than a year later, and we know President Jacob Zuma is going to court. That's the latest on this particular matter, to appeal the judgment that came out of it. So let's take a look at this short clip.
In this House need to thank former public protector advocate Thuli Madonsela for her report on state capture. It was her key findings in that report which were shocking and only amplified by the President's initial attempt to interdict the report's release to the public. Honourable Chairperson, Advocate Madonsela in a remedial action recommended that the President immediately establish a judicial commission of inquiry to probe the allegations of undue influence and improper conduct by the Gupta family over him. We know what the courts have said, and we are waiting for that process.
So there we have it. It was one of those years and one of those stories that just kept giving the Gupta emails. And as we are speaking, this past Friday, President Jacob Zuma lodging his latest appeal in this regard. So we haven't yet seen any action on Thuli Madonsela's state of capture report, as it were, from the president's side. Melo, let's start with you on this one.
For me, I mean, obviously, the judgment itself, I listened to Dustin Mlambo's reasoning overall, and I found it, in as much as the broad thrust of it, I agreed with it, that there needs to be a commission of inquiry and so on, but I found it lacking in certain respects. And then that sense that I found lacking was the fact that Parliament is featured nowhere in his judgment, because Parliament is supposed to be the seat of accountability of the executive. So in as much as, yes, we may say that the public protector said that the Chief Justice must choose a judge who head up a commission of inquiry, at no point have we interrogated whether or not we should have actually gone to a commission of inquiry to start off with. Shouldn't this thing have gone through Parliament so that Parliament can sort of review and hold the executive to account? Because Parliament has powers also to institute commissions of inquiry on its own and so on. So for me, that I found lacking.
But has Parliament not already done that? For example, in the ESCOM case, in the case of the SABC, they've already instituted those inquiries.
Exactly. But for me, that I felt that the public protector should have said in her report that Parliament should do that report. Because what I find that in this instance, what it does is that it sets us up on a wrong precedent, right? Because it says that, imagine the scenario where Balekam Beta was the Chief Justice. Do we then say that the public protector would have actually said, no, the Chief Justice must choose that judge? Because then for me, it becomes very difficult. There isn't really principle that we can apply going forward saying that this is what we always do in this instance. I feel that the reasoning is very much entrenched in the person of Jacob Zuma, saying that because we're dealing with Jacob Zuma now, we must go to Chief Justice Mogoeng.
But then how do you deal with the fact that President Jacob Zuma is directly implicated in this, Professor Siepe?
Yeah, I think there is a case to make on that issue, that if there's a conflict of interest, you like to minimize their role. But that is one principle that the Constitution seems to put. But there's also a principle that the Constitution also puts, which is the separation of powers. And the initial response of the Chief Justice when he heard about having to do that, he says, no, but I don't think it is actually correct, because his instinctive is that when the Constitution is very clear about who should appoint, then you want to stick to the letter and spirit. But then you must also deal with this other issue that has been raised. And I think this is where Justice Mlambo himself had become so embroiled in Jacob Zuma. Because
what do you mean by that?
No, because where the Constitution is very clear, where the Constitution is very clear, you simply say, what does the Constitution say in terms of this? And then you say, but there's this issue of conflict of interest. And hence, the approach by Jacob Zuma to the court is simply to seek clarity on that matter. But you go and say the man is reckless. Because the president and any other official is obligated, when the Constitution is very clear that this is your responsibility, and somebody else who must be below the Constitution says, but I would give it to somebody else. So that was the issue. It's not the issue of whether there should be a commission of inquiry. I think the alliance partners, including the president himself, had gone to court, to parliament to say, yes, I accept that there should be a commission of inquiry, and there was also pressure. So within the alliance, within the opposition, the idea of a commission has to be there, and it's agreed. But the issue that was raised is, how do we resolve this constitutional conundrum that says the president, and yes, I can understand, and it makes sense what the Justice Mlambo was saying. But at the same time, you need to have sympathy to say there is a need for clarity, and that clarity can only be provided by the courts. But you can't then move to say you are reckless. And even in the previous judgment, they said where there is a lack of clarity, the president must approach the courts. And then you approach the courts, then you are accused of recklessness.
In terms of context, what recklessness was he referring to?
He says, if you had agreed to the commission of inquiry, why do you appeal? But the president was simply appealing to the issue that had to do with his constitutional mandate that says you will establish a commission, or you must, or if it has to be established, it has to be the president.
But Ntakwana, did the Constitution anticipate that the president would be conflicted in a situation like this, and therefore him being directly implicated makes it difficult for him to be the one to appoint the judge that heads this up?
I think if one looks at it from a common sense perspective, it would probably say that anyone who is conflicted should not be in a position to appoint a judge to judge them. But I think, as Prof is saying, this is probably more complicated than, more complex than we see it, because it speaks to the mandate. I mean, when we started questioning this, I even said, courts have ruled on what Parliament has decided, for instance, with the funding of political parties, where it ordered Parliament to amend a law within 18 months. So in terms of the separation of powers, you can say, well, courts have a mandate to uphold the law regardless of which state institution we're talking about. But yes, I think this is something that we really have to look at and see how it pans out.
Can I just add one more thing there quickly? So for me, a good example of this thing, right, is the SASA case and how the Constitutional Court approached that thing, right? Because the Constitutional Court went and forced CPS to pay those social grants, right? And the reasoning that they used essentially was that there is no other institution where you can effectively realize those rights, right? So in essence, what they were saying is that we've exhausted all other possibilities for how to effect those social grants, right? Therefore, we're ordering new CPS in spite of what contract law says, right? So in this case, I feel that we haven't really exhausted all the avenues of how to hold the president to account. We've just jumped in the first instance.
What are the other avenues that could still be explored?
No, I'm saying that instead of forcing a presidential commission of inquiry, because we know it's going to create that conflict, so it's almost like you create a conflict by going to a presidential commission of inquiry, which you needn't have done that.
No,
right?
but I'm asking, what should they have done then?
No,
what avenues have not yet been exhausted?
Parliament. The public protector should have said that Parliament should run with this thing.
Yeah. You see, there's an issue here. The fear that emerges from the conflict of interest is that the president was going to choose a lackey. And once you argue that there are judges who are lackeys, then you as Mlambo must actually out those judges who are lackeys. Because being a lackey of a president, that means you're also corrupt. So if the judge begins to doubt his own colleagues, he must actually say, all of us are not clean. And then if all of us are not clean, we will want him to spell out who those are. And in addition, if you don't spell out those who are not clean, you yourself are corrupt. So it's not a sustainable argument that was actually being put, because he himself was selected by Jacob Zuma. And remember, the same argument was made about Chief Justice Mogoeng, that actually he was presented as a skunk of the judiciary. And even civil society was saying, no, this guy should not be appointed. Now suddenly he's a wonderful man. He's the flavor of the month. So I do think that the judges are protected by the independence and the guarantees that they have. And we should not impugn the integrity of judges. If Jacob Zuma appoints a judge If the judge is corrupt, we'll know. And we should be, but we assume that these are people of integrity, unless we are told differently. So if Jacob Zuma appoints a particular judge, and then we should continue. I think here what we have is the issue of separation of powers, because our democracy that is the most fundamental. So the issue of conflict of interest, we should find a way of managing it without undermining the fundamentals of a democracy.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting one, and I'm sure we'll be besieged by this in the new year, another year where there will be a lot coming out of stories that we've dragged out of 2017. And of course, the question is why the security agencies, the Hawks, you have the police and all the others who were supposed to have at least looked at investigations have been so quiet on this particular matter. But of course, as I said, I have no doubt that story will drag itself into 2018 as well. But another story that hit the headlines in 2017 saw the establishment of a commission of arbitration for the Life Esidimeni inquiry into the death of more than 143 psychiatric patients. And we'll tell you more about this after the break. Now, one of the most heart-wrenching stories of 2017 is the Life Esidimeni tragedy. 143 mentally ill patients died after being moved from Life Esidimeni to multiple facilities, some of which were not even registered. An inquiry led by retired Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, the Deputy Chief Justice, was set up to probe the botched removal of patients. The public hearings into the deaths of psychiatric patients were very emotional, and testimonies of some of the senior health officials were a shocking display of utter ignorance. The last testimony was of suspended HOD Dr. Bani Selebano, who earlier denied being responsible but later asked for forgiveness from the affected families. Selebano admitted that the department erred when it ignored warnings from families and psychiatrists within the department about the patient relocation project. The hearings are expected to resume on January the 18th, and the former Gauteng Health MEC Ketani Mahlangu is expected to present herself before Moseneke. Now, arguably, there are very few stories that could have been bigger than Life Esidimeni in 2017. And just in terms of the emotion that it evoked and some of the shocking revelations that came to light in Takwana, this was really one of those stories that we will remember for a long, long time.
Absolutely, Sakina. I think the other thing that really strikes one is when you listen to people who you believe should have been put in those positions because they, as you say, are competent, but seem to have made decisions that clearly indicate that they had absolutely no idea what they were doing. And so it speaks to, I think, one of the things that the ANC talked about at their conference, which is deployment of cadres. And it seems it would be, I think, one of those classic cases, which is sad, yeah.
The issue of ignorance and arrogance, you know, there's this culture of fear that seems to have been pervasive throughout, looking at who you speak to. The Ombud, the Health Ombuds report also speaks to that, Melo. So, again, with regard to deployment, some, and I think it was Aubrey Machikli who said, the ANC has become adept at recycling failure. You look at Dr. Bani Silibano, and he used to head up the Charlotte Maxeke Hospital. And then you move him to Life Esidimeni. Well, if things were not going great there at Charlotte Maxeke, you know, should we be moving people around and promoting them to positions where greater responsibility is required?
I think for me, this question of Life Esidimeni needs to be located in the broader socio-political context, right? And that context is within South Africa, the way we view people with intellectual disabilities, the way we view people with mental illnesses, right? Obviously, there is a distinction there, and I think that is one distinction that has not necessarily come out of this, that having intellectual disability, being a slow learner as you were, or having a severe disability, and having mental illnesses are two different things, and these are things that what we're dealing with here in the Life Esidimeni case. For me, those things form part of the stigma of society where sort of families also sort of outsource that function to a state bureaucracy such that the state bureaucracy can be able to help them and assist them with that thing. And then obviously then it poses the question of what then role or responsibility do families continue to have in that sense where they've outsourced that function to government functionaries.
I agree with you. Families do not get a free pass on this issue. However, we still expect when people are placed as charges of the state that the state would take maximum care in making sure that they remain safe, Professor.
Yeah, I think what we should accept is that there was a general failure not only at the level of the state, but also the professionals. Because when you look at these people, we're talking about people who are medical doctors. And when you're a doctor, you take an oath, first do no harm. So there was a failure at that level. There was also a failure at the political level, because it's not, you see, what people are trying to do is to find a scapegoat. But when you look at almost everybody who was affected, even those who were transporting people. I mean, you even have those who were benefiting by taking bodies that died, the way they treated. So it goes back to your concept of when you have people who are helpless, the most helpless of our society, it's almost like we can do without them.
But what I disagree with is this issue of scapegoating. It's not about scapegoating people. It's about people having to take responsibility and accountability
what I'm saying that,
for their actions.
Yeah, the point I'm making is that it is not about finding one person who is guilty. What I'm saying is that from every level, from the doctors who see the patients, from the officials who decide where to take these patients, from the people who can see that there's something wrong and they do nothing, because the deaths...
Why start at the bottom? Why don't you start at the top coming down? Because the buck stops ultimately with the MEC.
Yes.
Or we can even go up and say with the premier of the province.
Exactly.
Let's come from the top down, because it's easy to always blame officials at the bottom. But let's start there.
No, but when you're a professional, there's the issue of professional integrity. As a doctor, your job is not to be so scared. What I found is this culture of fear that they seem to be permeating, because everybody tells you that we're scared of this woman. How can you, as a doctor, when you can actually be a professional? So, yes, she must be found guilty. Yes, I mean, of course, she has to present the case, but the premier must also indicate when did you become aware of this. But what we should look at is also the doctors themselves have responsibility. This is why you saw some of them even shocked. I mean, it was quite embarrassing when they could not explain themselves that how could you have allowed this? Because ultimately, we come down to the doctor-patient, and they failed there. So I think there should be an issue of a professional accountability, but there should also be political accountability. And it should start with the Premier, should come with the MEC, and even the entire cabinet
Then we work our way down. But I think we've also become embroiled in a culture in this country whereby the politicians always go scot-free when things happen, and it's always the professionals and those lower down who have to take accountability when things go wrong.
No, I absolutely agree. For me, I think what you're saying about the culture, because even the politicians themselves, I think they would have taken different decisions if, as a society, the issue of people with intellectual disabilities, mental illnesses was viewed differently. I think there was that sort of like recognition perhaps on their part that they could get away with it to some extent. We could take these people, outsource them to all of these other things. Nobody cares. Nobody's going to check. Nobody's going to know. So we could do that. So I think you're absolutely correct in that sense that on that level also there needs to be a level of conscientization that these people are also humans. I think it speaks to something that former Chief Justice Arthur Chaskalson said, is that it is only when the worst and the weakest among us are protected that the rest of us can also be assured that our rights will also be secured. And I think in this sense we've failed in that regard.
I think with the greatest of sensitivity, Sakina, some of the cases you could hear that the families did not even know that their loved ones...
They'd abandoned their loved ones in the care of the state.
So I really agree with this to an extent, that there is that general sense of, they're not our problem, if you know what I mean.
I totally agree. You cannot abandon your loved one in the care of the state and then expect not to be held accountable yourself. That needs to be interrogated as well, and I don't think we saw enough of that. But I suppose the process where we are at right now is about looking at what went wrong, why, and how. And we have to hold people accountable here. But also, we need to interrogate the families. And they need to also be held accountable for their actions. And people would say, but someone is poor. Yes, but you are not so poor, because government gives grants in South Africa. You are not so poor that you cannot put through one call in 3 months just to check, is Sakina still okay? How has she been doing? Even if it's just for 2 minutes. I personally do not buy that.
I think just one last comment. Another thing, obviously, that I think hopefully would come out of this entire process is that if you look at children as a category, they're a protected category in terms of the law and so on. So people with mental illnesses and intellectual disabilities, I think that's something also that they should be a protected group, such that it gives government sort of like that legislative platform to be able to intervene in that sense. I think there is that big gaping gap there, and then people haven't really looked at that.
And once again, 2018 will prove to be interesting as this story continues, with Letani Mahlangu expected to appear before the inquiry there. But after the break, we'll take a look at one of the other big stories on the continent, and that of the coup in Zimbabwe.
Pump up your energy, keeping you in action through sports updates while resting at home. This is what's happening in your world of sport every weekend.
In the second half, Kolisi and Jaco Kriel combined well, and Kolisi scored his second try. He was also named man of the match.
Confusion from the West defenders gifted Batosi with a close-range goal.
In the 10th round, he pinned a visibly fatigued McGregor on the ropes and hammered the Irishman before the referee stepped in to stop the bout.
He's a tough competitor. He's a lot more experienced, especially in the layout.
Keep it locked on Sports Live every Saturday and Sunday at 20:30.
Now, one of Africa's longest-serving rulers, Robert Mugabe, finally exited offices in a bloodless military coup in November. The Zimbabwean president had been in office since Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, and the country demised from being the breadbasket of Africa to a failed state due to bad governance and bad leadership. The economy also floundered, unemployment levels soared, political opponents were ruthlessly dealt with, and many Zimbabweans fled the country to look for greener pastures in other countries. But the final straw was when Mugabe sacked the incumbent, President Emmerson Mnangagwa, in an apparent bid to pave the way for his wife, Grace Mugabe, to become the president. But before we ask the panel what they made of this story and what stood out for them, let's just take a look at this short insert.
Following the address we made on 13 November 2017, which we believe our main broadcaster, Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, and the Herald were directed not to publicize, the situation in our country has moved to another level. Comrade R.G. Mugabe and his family are safe and sound, and their security is guaranteed. We are only targeting criminals around him who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice.
Well, let's start here. We were talking, during the break about whether this was a coup or not. Well, it had all the hallmarks of a coup.
Yeah, I think, Sakina, you're quite correct. If you go to a dictionary and you look at what a coup says, it will put it as an unconstitutional seizure of power. And because the way we transferred power is through elections. So here there were no elections, and you had the president who had run for elections and who was actually removed. And the military was at pains to try to make sure that it is not a coup. That's why they went through all this rigmarole, ultimately saying there must be a party decision and then this must go to parliament. But they were trying to clean up the mess, because effectively what Robert Mugabe was going to do was going to argue that given the position of the AU on coups, the military or the new government was not going to enjoy any form of legitimacy. But when you talk to people in Zimbabwe, first of all, we must accept that there was a celebration by almost everybody. People who felt relieved. But what I found interesting is that there was a tendency to say there's nothing wrong with Mugabe, it is the criminals around him. That's very interesting, and that he is actually going to be protected. But the ultimate point is that some have put it as simply a resolution of factional battles within the ZANU-PF, and they see this as a military consolidation. Because they say, whatever you make of Mugabe, Mugabe was never a soldier. The new person is actually a soldier. But the pronouncement that he has made seems to be encouraging. It is really up to the Zimbabweans and up to the leadership to say we are going to take a different path from the path we've had for the last 37 years.
And Takwana, the question, of course, is whether this has changed the fortunes of Zimbabwe and Zimbabweans.
Well, Sakina, yesterday, President Emmerson Mnangagwa was in South Africa, and thousands of Zimbabweans inundated the embassy in Pretoria. First, there were those who were going, I think, to congratulate him, but then there were those who were saying that he should account for the Matabeleland massacres, who were protesting outside the embassy. But generally, I think, let me go back to the issue of whether or not this was a coup. Accompanying him was the man that you saw in that clip, Major General Sibusiso Moyo, who has now been promoted and apparently is now the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Zimbabwe. So now there are other army generals who have been appointed to cabinet positions. And so this speaks to whether or not we can say this was a coup. But as Prof says, they tried everything they could to ensure that nobody can describe it as such, because Sibusiso Moyo in that broadcast actually said The president is still the head of state and still the commander-in-chief of the army. So you could not say that he had been deposed at that point in time. Nonetheless, I think in terms of hope for Zimbabweans, many of them say that they are hopeful that this is going to change with what Emmerson Mnangagwa is saying or is promising. And from what I could read yesterday when he spoke, first he spoke of the CAF and then said, oh, by the way, I forgot that I have a speech. But that speech in itself that he had made, I think, was so inspiring for many people, even without reading the text. So it speaks to someone who really understands what should be done and has it kind of at his fingertips.
But he, of course, has his work cut out for him. But I suppose on the upside, you could say the upshot of all of this is that Zimbabwe has gone so low that the only way is up for them now. Yeah. But where does he start, Melo, with rebuilding?
I think for me it's going to be interesting to see whether he starts reversing some of those indigenization policies, because those things were very much contentious with Western investors, as it were. And I think part of that problem that he's going to, well, less of a problem is because I think that situation became embroiled in the personality of Robert Mugabe, where people had realized that sanctions were sort of like tied to Robert Mugabe, and the continued insistence of having Robert Mugabe as president of Zimbabwe, it would almost be like a concession on the West's part that actually they've been defeated by Robert Mugabe. So the fact that Robert Mugabe has now stepped down, it means that whatever sanctions it is that they had put in place, they can now sort of like pull them back without seeming like they've lost something. For me, the overall description that I'd give to this thing is that if you look at the Zimbabwean constitution, right, it's very clear and it spells out how and when and by whom the military can get deployed. So therefore, when General Chiwenga was doing his little exercise there, that thing was outside the powers and the ambit of the constitution in Zimbabwe. So therefore, it points to some sort of extra constitutional measure, which a coup would seem to describe that type of activity. And for me, also, the other thing that I realize about Mnangagwa is that Mnangagwa was almost politically dribbled, if you could put it like that, within the Zimbabwean political scene. Because Grace Mugabe, Jonathan Moyo, and the rest of the G40, what they did is that they made sure that they had captured the youth league with Chibangade. They'd also made sure that they captured the women's league. They'd make sure that they'd captured sort of cabinet. So it's almost like they had those centers of power. The only center of power that they had not really captured at that moment was the military, and then from there on they felt confident enough that they could push Mnangagwa out because they had that sort of like on the ground political support. So Mnangagwa, seeing that actually that he's been outmaneuvered politically, now he goes and activates the military, sort of like the nuclear option, and says, military, come by force and actually install me as president and so on. So it's almost like you have the military ratifying and elevating one faction of ZANU-PF over another, which I think for me is not a very positive outcome in terms of democracy. Because the one thing that I think Mnangagwa should have done is similar to what Jacob Zuma did when Mbeki fired him, is that Jacob Zuma went to the branches and he mobilized. So the question is, why didn't Mnangagwa go to the ZANU-PF branches and mobilize such that they had an upcoming elective conference?
Because he didn't have to. He had the backing of the military there. But, Prof, I know, but time is the issue here. So just in the interest of time, and everybody's talking about, a new dawn for Zimbabwe, but the reality is we cannot look away from the fact that the people who are in power now have been part of the leadership of ZANU-PF and of Zimbabwe, along with Robert Mugabe since 1980.
Yeah, I guess the point that you raised about the nuclear option that was open was the military. This is why people said this was a military consolidation, which resolved the factional battles. But what people thought, if you're talking about the new chapter, they thought there would be a government of national unity. Instead, what he did, he simply brought the same people that he's comfortable with, but also understanding that what had sustained President Mugabe was the military. So I don't see, in as much as we must be prisoners of hope, that the Zimbabwe can move out of this. And the statements that have been made are encouraging. I think all we can do is to encourage this, but to say that the job is already done, it will be failure to realize these intricacies that explains that you now have a military consolidation, and you have now the people who are in the military now coming into cabinet. So it is that the level of consolidation that is happening there.
I think for me, just one more thing that I could add to that is that in the Zimbabwe, what you'd have is you have the issue of bread versus freedom, right? So it's almost like now that economy will start getting revived now because people, the investors have faith in Mnangagwa. But in terms of freedoms, that is not really guaranteed now because you have the military in charge. So it's almost like the China situation where they say that, you know what, you guys favor freedom and bread in South Africa, but we are happy to have bread first and then we'll deal with freedoms after and rights.
Well, thank you for watching our show, Media Monitor, and hope you will join us again at same time, same place next week. From me and the rest of the team, we wish you a Merry Christmas and good day and stay blessed.